Southeast of McCracken, approximately 5 miles. And at about age 4, we moved west of McCracken, which would about 9.5 miles, and just north of Bazine by 6.5 miles. And that was our home. We went to Mass Church in McCracken, and we went and did our business in Bazine. So it was kind of a split trip as far as we were concerned. And we went to school in Bazine. After completing our primary education, first 8 grades in a small country school a half mile from our home. And was fortunate, we had some real good teachers. That we had 3 in particular, and 2 when I was in the 6th and 7th grade. And it carried right on through on the 8th. He was able to stimulate interest in the students, and they really went to work for him. And this followed on up with another teacher that was almost as good. I won't say equally good. From that point then, went to Bazine High School, graduated there in 33, and went to Creighton University. Spent 2 years in pre-med. It was one of the last class to get in on a 2-year pre-med program. So it was 6 years of steady school at Creighton University in Omaha. I took my hospital work then at Mary's Help Hospital in San Francisco. And that was a semi-industrial hospital. We did a lot of industrial work in addition to family practice. And it was a good internship or hospital time.
What do you mean by an industrial work?
People that were working, laborers in construction and so forth, and their various injuries.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. Not just physicals, but injuries, traumatic injuries.
Oh, traumatic injuries.
I see.
We had considerable orthopedics involved, which was real good, because I just finished, before I finished my hospital work, Uncle Sam called.
Oh.
So instead of going on to St. Joseph Hospital in San Francisco, where I had a residency in obstetrics and gynecology, I went into the service.
Right. Now, by this time you were married?
Not at that point.
Not yet, okay.
I went into the service and was, that was at Hamilton Field. It's probably about 23 miles north of San Francisco, right on the bay. And we lived then, it was August the 6th in 41 that we were married then. 40. All right, 40.
Oh, don't forget those things. Oh, dear.
That's bad, isn't it? When you come up with a wrong date on your anniversary. Ooh. But anyway, I was then sent, I was assigned to the hospital there. We also had a tactical assignment, and I was assigned to the 35th Pursuit Group, which was a training organization. They weren't supposed to see combat. They were just to be trained in that and then moved to the active units that would be going overseas and fighting in case fighting erupted. Well, somewhere along the line, things changed, and I tried to get into the 21st Pursuit Group, which was the active group. And the colonel, after the 3rd request, he informed me he wanted to hear no more of it. And that I was going to stay there at Hamilton Field, and I wasn't going to be moved. That was the whole thing. And about that point, the orders came out for the 35th to activate and get out. We were headed for Plum, ordered to buy all heavy winter clothes, and then we headed for the Philippines.
With all your heavy winter clothes.
That made a lot of sense, but that was what we had to do. And we'd been married, and Bill was 5 months old, I believe, at that time when I left, something like that. We left from San Francisco, boarded the luxury liner Coolidge. Really had a tough passage, 5 to a stateroom of the officers' area. It was a very smooth ride, including the morning that everybody got sick. You had the roll of the ship, there were long waves, and you had the roll of the ship, it'd come up and then fall over. Then it dropped down, back up on the other way, and roll back. Well, there were very few that ate breakfast that morning, and I managed to get to the door of we had to go down a deck. Managed to get to the door of the deck, and I was feeling all right. Opened the door, and my, oh my, the odor was awful. But from the Midwest, and a country boy, I went right on downstairs. I ate a nice healthy breakfast and felt fine. It was wonderful to watch the other fellas that start to come down and lose their cookies.
Right.
So it was a nice trip over. From Guam, we were escorted by a cruiser all the way in. They gave us problems on lights out and all this and that. We got into Manila. Our planes arrived. We had gotten there. They were new planes. They had to be slow timed, that flying in the air and putting so many hours on the motors. And then the Cosmoline had to come off of the guns, because in cold weather that particular type of protective agent froze. The guns wouldn't operate in altitude. But we were still in peacetime at Manila and Nichols Field. You had to draw everything you wanted from at 8 o'clock in the morning for the entire day. It wasn't open until, from noon on. It was closed till 8 o'clock the next morning. And it was a mess because we weren't able to get our plane slow timed. We weren't able to get the Cosmoline off all the guns. They were brand new planes that they weren't fit to fly in combat whatsoever.
What were they, Bill?
P-40s.
P-40s?
Mm-hmm. And as a result, it was a pretty bad deal. The other thing was that, and I think that was the big thing, and I hope to God the Army never does it again. The Philippines was a place of getting the 8 balls out of the service. For every 2 years or every year that was spent in the Philippines, they received 2 years toward retirement. Instead of court-martial and get rid of them or retire them, they had put them over there.
Oh.
So we ran into all kinds of command trouble. And as in a later incident in this Peninsula defense, we had 4 COs in one 24-hour period.
Oh my.
2 of them had accidental gunshot wounds to their big toe. So it was really not very good material that we had as top at that point.
When you needed it so bad.
We took over some real fine men and real good officers, but they were junior. So automatically rank took over. At Nichols Field, at the day of the war, the war started, we were strafed. But we had been ordered to disperse, and we did. Our planes had been scattered over small fields here and there, many of whom I was never acquainted with as far as the flying field, because they were dirt strips. And we moved out onto the edge of the Nichols Field, had orders to dig foxholes. Well, thunder, I wasn't too anxious to be digging foxholes. Couldn't see much sense in it. The sky was nice and clear, no rain, no clouds, no nothing. But I did, fortunately. I dug a foxhole, half-hearted, but it was just deep enough. I'll say that. Because when they came in, they raised thunder with the hangars and so forth, and then came right down the strafe and bombed us. I had dirt thrown all over me and partially covered up with the dirt from the bombs, and then the strafing went on. And I'm sure that some of that dirt that was there was recently excavated by my hands too, because I was digging. I was like the rest of them. My foxhole got deeper. But I had to go to work. We had some injuries, and I think that was the big thing, salvation as far as I was concerned. I had to get back to work. Our ground officers weren't around, and the sergeants came to me and wondering what to do. There's a medical officer telling them what they were supposed to be doing, and a reserve at that with a limited amount of experience. I said, you see that cook tent up there? I said, that's a mess. Let's get it straightened up, and then why don't you go down the line and see what you can do? Well, that satisfied everything. The sergeants put everybody to work, and that was fine.
Seemed like the logical thing to do, didn't it?
It was quite logical and the only thing to be done. Right. We got cleaned up. Then an amusing incident happened. This man, Grascio, we talked about yesterday, Sammy Grascio. He was a first lieutenant, or second lieutenant in the Air Corps at that point. And he came in, landed after the bombing. Well, everybody went right down to the line that was free to see what was going on, because you could see his engine was sputtering, and he was had been shot up some, and he'd lost his two wingmen, and he pulled up and he taxied up and stopped. Well, I was really quite apprehensive as to what was going on, how bad was he hurt, and so forth. Canopy came open and he climbed out. Now, he was a young Italian man, but you talk about chatter, he was really chattering. He had, when I saw him come out, he was quite all right. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Then I was laughing. It was comedy then, because I couldn't help but see the damage to the plane and all of that, but what a relief that he was well. And it was really maybe kind of foolish, but I was laughing quite heartily.
Probably all the tension.
We were good friends anyway. And so from that point on, it was all downhill. When we left the Nichols field, we were loaded up in trucks and a convoy around the bay. And exactly where they dumped us off, I'm not quite sure, but we had a field there that we used as an small airstrip for observation. The morning we left, we stopped at the church or the cathedral in Manila, and I was quite surprised. Father was there, and one of the priests was there, and he insisted we have some bacon and eggs, and on our way. And so we had a nice send-off from that. But we went on around Manila, around the bay to Bataan, and we were not the first that were there. There were a number of others. You had the 31st Infantry, and you had other units, including the Philippine Scouts, lined up. Now, the Philippine Army was no different than if you went out and conscripted a group of high school kids from the city, possibly, who had no experience with firearms. That's changing with the handguns, but no experience with handguns, and gave them a gun and told them they were in the Army. That was the Philippine Army. Now, the Scouts were a well-trained, wonderful unit.
And they were Filipinos?
Filipino Scouts.
Did they have American
officers and Filipino Scouts.
But the regular Army was not trained and not experienced?
The regular Army that they had, the 31st Infantry, was well trained. It was a good unit also. But the Philippine Army was really nothing when it come down to it.
So they weren't the units you wanted next to you?
They weren't the ones I wanted next to me, no.
I understand.
Absolutely not. Not if I had to depend on them. So they formed the line of defense. They were able to hold from the time that they came into the Philippines until they were surrendered. They did not surrender, but they were surrendered. General King surrendered them. We had this small airstrip and one little observation plane, scout plane. And for the moment, that was where I was located. We got bombed every day, and the foxhole kept getting deeper and deeper. After a while, I decided that if I should happen to get a hit close and get it caved in, I'd never get out. So I dug a different one, moved to a different spot, and started all over. But it was interesting. I went up a couple of times, but this one time, this pilot and I went up, and you have to be friends or they don't invite you. And you have to be a bit pushy or they won't invite you also. So I wanted to see what was going on, and so we went up and flying around. And it came down to, it was just before dusk, so we were up then as it began to get dark. I had one little string of lights for our landing strip, and that was it. There weren't very many, and they weren't bright at all. And the wind was blowing. We came in. This was the first time this had ever happened to me, and I wasn't too pleased because we were coming in crosswise to the landing strip. I could look out the side of the plane and see the lights down here. The plane was headed this way. And just before we touched down, he straightened it up, and we just moved right onto the strip, and that was it. But that was the first time. That's what they call crabbing it in. And that's what he had done, and it was a beautiful landing. But that wasn't so good, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, if you were going to land.
Our next episode was, from there we were moved on down into a little farther along because the Japs had landed on some of the peninsula behind us, some of the points behind us. Agaloma Point was one, and we were assigned beach defense and to clear them out. And, well, it's not much different than the Philippine Army. Our men, except for a few of the old men that had been in the infantry and then eventually ended up in the Air Corps, had had no experience with hand grenades or rifles or that, so we were somewhat in the same boat as the Philippine Army. Pretty darn green. We got some injuries. The Philippines, the Japanese had set out their snipers. And in the jungle they used firecrackers an awful lot. It was quite disturbing. You weren't sure whether it was their rifle fire, machine gun type of fire, or their real light machine gun, or whether it was firecrackers. And you'd hear it here, and then you'd hear it there. In the meantime, one of the snipers would be at work, or more than one. And we were living in pretty much of a glass cage. Colonel Dias, or was Captain Dias at that time, had an idea, and they fixed up a little boat, barge type of thing. They didn't have a boat. A barge, and I don't know where they scrounged an outboard motor, but they did, and they came in from the water, and they had set up a 50 caliber machine gun on the little barge, and they hit the Japs from behind or from the water front. And we were behind, we were on land. So there wasn't much of any place for them to go. And these sergeants then took over on the infantry, and they loaded up with hand grenades, and they had these interconnecting foxholes that they had dug. And they just they just rolled a grenade into each hole that they came to. Well, the trouble was that about a half of the grenades didn't function.
Oh, they
So
left over.
that was the way with a lot of the ammunition. A lot of the bombs we had didn't function, and it was old armament and munitions, and so we weren't using very good material. We got them out of there. We had some injuries, and it wasn't too long then till the time that we had to surrender. At the time we went back to Barton, moved around to Barton, there were a tremendous number of civilians that came with us. I think there was approximately 100,000 all told of Army and civilians. Well, the Army had planned on maybe 20,000 to feed 20,000. And within a month we were down to half rations. And a month later we were down to fourth rations. We held out for another 2 months, and our men we were undergoing starvation before we ever started. You had malaria and dysentery that were prominent wherever you went there, and then you had the starvation on top of it. And that was the group of people that started out on this march. That's why the casualty rate was so high. A 100-kilometer march for men in good condition is nothing absurd, or they can make it without problem. But this was in the tropics. We started out with a group of men that were many of them sick with fever and this and that on this march. Those that dropped out and lagged behind were either bayoneted or shot. And the Japanese did love their bayonets. And it was tropics, real hot weather. You marched right down between tremendous mango trees, that type of tree, tall, they shaded, but not the blacktop. We were on blacktop. As a result, there was no wind, and it was sultry and humid, and any rest stops we had were right on the blacktop. We would walk right by artesian wells. The men that broke were either shot or bayoneted, and at least we didn't see them again. And then they did stop us on one occasion right over a caribou wallow. The old caribou got out and defecated as it got out, and I tried to stop the men, but no. They had had one canteen of water for a day, and that was it. And they were extremely thirsty. Those with fever, they were dehydrated, and they're bad. Had nothing to do but go down and move the moss and feces off the water, and they drank it there, and they filled their canteens. Many of those men did not make it on into camp because the extreme fulminating diarrhea. And we got into San Fernando. We did have a night's rest there. We were up bright and early the next morning, and were loaded into box cars. I say box cars, they're metal cars, grain cars, really. They were small cars, not the size we have. And 100 men to a car. And they saw to it with the point of a bayonet. I was fortunate that I was somewhat near a door, though I did get some air. There were vents on the roof of these cars, one on each end, but they were closed. So it was a real nightmare as far as the trip went. The trip wasn't so long from there to Tarlac, but the amount of time that we spent on the railroad before it moved, and the heat that was present. We were packed in like sardines. Some of the men died. They never did hit the floor. They was packed in that tight. There was no, here we are packed in, locked in, men defecating and urinating, unable to control it. No fault of theirs. But we were a horrible stinking mess when we got out of the off the train and headed for the last 6 kilometers into O'Donnell. So it was not a very pleasant train ride as far as that went. We started out on the walk and was getting along all right, and about the, probably about 3 or 4 kilometers from the camp, one of the men in our group began to drag, and I pointed to him, and the guard said, nodded, yes, go ahead, so I was helping him, and the two of us just barely made it in. But if I hadn't done that, I don't know whether he would have been able to get there or not. As it was, it didn't matter too long. I think he lasted about 2 days afterwards. We got into O'Donnell. We were told that we were their prisoners. They had not signed the Geneva Convention, and that would not be followed. And they didn't. It was in our area for a large number of people. There was one water spigot, a little water spigot that you had to try and get water sometime during the 24 hours. If you could get your canteen under it and get some water in it, you were pretty fortunate. At the end of 24 hours, 36 I guess it was, close to that, I know I wakened up and I wasn't able to see. Well, you could see it was light and dark and that was it. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I started feeling my face, and my eyelids were all puffed up, swollen tight. I pressed on them and worked them a little bit, massaged them and lifted. You could see there wasn't anything wrong with my eyes. My eyelids were all swollen, just the same in the rest of my body. A number of the men didn't recover from that. They died from pulmonary congestion and heart failure, in addition to everything else. I developed a fulminating diarrhea, and within probably 8 hours I was almost skin and bones, so it seemed. And really, well, you didn't get off the throne, but there was no throne. So that was the situation. And I got along after that until I came down with malaria. But at that point, Dr. Anderson, who was from Del Norte, Colorado, he was in private practice and had been called into the New Mexico National Guard. He and I happened to be tossed together in this barracks, and his men came around wanting to know what to do about this and that, and